into it because we don't want any of that good stuff to be left unsaid without it being recorded.
No.
So Dan Valenti has a beautiful new book. It's a book of poetry, third person singular, but more important, it's just great to see you, man.
Well, good to see you, John, and great to be here. You know, we're podcasting. And when I hear that term, it reminds me of Invasions of the Body Snatchers. Do you remember the film? There was the original film was done in the 50s, but then it was updated. And these alien spores grow human like
I really want to know the connection to podcasting.
Well,
because eating people.
When the alien spores develop, they develop through pods.
Ah, okay.
And they become duplicates and replicas. So, example, if a John Kroll pod were to be developing somewhere in this studio, then
I think right over there.
Yeah. I think I see it, as a matter of fact. Still in its early stages, thank God. You would be coming from a pod. So anyway, and that's how my mind works, you see, because pod is a word. And during the invasion of the body snatchers, it had one use and meaning, and now we are podcasting. So it has another. And that was part of the fascination for me, even early on as a kid.
I'm actually fascinated. Where did that word come from? Pod. I mean, obviously you could put it together, Google it, folks, but podcast, and it's a ubiquitous term now, but where, but
where does any word come from?
And we're casting. Okay.
Why do we call a car seat and not a wastebasket? It's an organic process. And if you trace the history of language all the way back far enough, we eventually lose the beginnings, of course, because it's prehistory. And we don't really know, other than to surmise that it began with a series of gestures and grunts, and the grunts became more refined as we had to find ways to communicate ever more complicated thoughts and ideas. And that was a result of, instead of 4 or 5 people living alone in a cave, now we got together with other people in other caves, and we developed little tribes and villages and communities. Eventually, you work your way up through the many millennia, and now we're in this thing called civilization, which, John, think about it. It's only, depending on how you measure it, maybe 7,000 years old.
Maybe. And then there's some who have theories
that nothing.
I mean, who knows? I mean, do we really, really know our history? You know what I'm saying? So
we don't. And knowing history and knowing origins, especially the origins of something as mysterious as language, is a case of inductive reasoning. In other words, we look for clues and we observe that happened, and then this came along and that came along. We assemble all these different little pieces of information and we arrive at a conclusion. And that's pretty much how how historians and academics have pieced together how language developed and worked. All I know is, for little Dan Valenti, words fascinated me from the beginning. I'll give you an example. Our first television, this is going back through the 50s, was a GE model. It was a big console, and TVs back then, of course, as you probably know, John, through your parents, they were pieces of furniture. Remember that?
100%. Oh, I do remember the early days in my life when it was still furniture, but
it was furniture, and they housed the video tubes, the cathode ray tubes, and these beautiful pieces of mahogany and oak and what have you. So we had the GE
Very
TV
swanky stuff back
and
in the 60s.
We had one channel, WRGB out of Schenectady, New York, which was, I believe, the very first television when TV started because of GE. And so we had the television, and then a miracle happened long about 1960, 1961, and we got two other channels from the Albany area. We got WTEN, Channel 10 out of Albany, and WAST, Albany, Schenectady, Troy, which was Channel 13 out of Schenectady. And my point with words is this: shows would come on, and at the conclusion of many of them, you would see the credits. And the credits often, it was a stylistic thing back then, maybe a technological limitation, but often the credits would start at the bottom of the screen and go up to the top and on a scroll, and they'd roll by. And as a kid, I used to think that all those words were being stored in the top of the television set. So when Bill Witherow, our TV guy, would come over with his toolbox to replace a couple of vacuum tubes in the back.
Be careful of the words in there.
Yeah,
you don't want to lose them.
Well, I was expecting, the old joke with the snakes in the can, and they all come out. I thought that when he unscrewed the back of the TV, all these words would spill out, and I would like grab them up. That didn't happen, but again, it just I was just fascinated. Where do the words go? What do the words mean? And long about that same time, I was a student at Mount Carmel School, long since passed. It was a Catholic parochial education. Great years for me, kindergarten through 8th grade, because we really learned about writing and grammar, and the sisters, the Venerini sisters, taught it well. And in kindergarten, well, not kindergarten, maybe 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, maybe all of the classrooms up to grade 8 had the alphabet on the various walls of the classroom, and you'd see the capital letter A and the small letter A. Do you recall that?
I do,
yeah.
Sure. I think they still have that today.
Capital
actually.
B, small b. And I would look up at the alphabet spread before me on one wall. It would usually be the front wall of the classroom as you faced it. And I'd look at those 26 characters, and at some point, I want to place it in 5th grade. That's when we really started to read poetry. And we got into John Greenleaf Whittier and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who lived in Pittsfield. For his summer home was where Pittsfield High School is right now.
Sure.
And so with poetry, it started to make an impression upon me how language was rhythmical and musical and more than just words on a page. And I would look at these 26 characters, A through Z, and be astounded that everything that I've ever read in the English language and would ever read would come from just a juggling of those 26 characters.
Yeah.
And the combinations are probably literally inexhaustible.
And then understanding how in other languages, sometimes much more complex in the way that letters or characters work. I think, if you go to like Hebrew or even Chinese, it's a different framework as to how these characters are. And they almost have maybe even double meanings and that sort of thing. I don't know if, how our language evolved as well as you do, but it is fascinating because everything is symbolism in a lot of ways.
Language is symbolism. The letter A corresponds with the sound I just made, A, and B, C, and phonics is a whole part of that. But you made a great point that irrespective of the language, whether it's German or Japanese or Chinese or English, British English, or our version, the, the key to learning a language is really to understand that all languages have certain commonalities as to how they work. Now, the specifics of grammar and all of that, of course, are different, but the mechanisms are the same, I think, because human beings are the same. Our brains, left side is more of the mathematical and scientific side. Right side is more of the creative side. Notice when I said right side, I pointed to my left. Okay.
I did notice.
Now that proves I'm a poet. Okay. Right there.
I wasn't going to say anything, Dan, but
no, I know, but I could see the look in your eye, John. I have a good friend of mine, a best friend in grade school, Jerome Packard, Jerri, who is now at the university. I get these mixed up. He is in, I believe, no, Chuck Trzynka is another childhood friend who is former chair of the business department at the Kelley School of Management in Bloomington, Indiana, University of Indiana. Jerri teaches, I think, in Michigan, maybe Illinois, but he turned into, you'd never know it from his grammar school days when he was he was one of those indifferent students who just wasn't challenged enough. He became one of the renowned scholars of Mandarin on the planet today. And he is still all about, just recently retired, about how the Chinese language works and comes together. And we've had discussions about the mechanisms of language. So that all fits into, again, my fascination with these things. And regardless of the language, if it's Japanese, ue udohi, ayudako, michidana kobore, koboshinasa, hai, ai kidohi, koboshinasa. I just said some words there that probably most people won't understand, except for our Japanese speakers out there. And pretty much I used the same mechanics or platform, that's the word we use today, to put those sounds and symbols together to make a language. You know, all of this boils down to the fact that poetry was really my first form of serious experimentation with writing.
When was that, Dan?
Well, I got serious about it. I remember dabbling in grammar school. The 8th grade talent show, I performed with a friend a couple of skits, and then later on I came out and I read a version of a satiric version of the famous poem by Joyce Kilmer called Trees. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. And it's this lovely ode of praise to trees.
And you did it so in a satirical way.
I did it in a satirical way. Yeah.
And,
the original.
By the way, you didn't do, it wasn't slam poetry.
No, it wasn't slam poetry, but I got slammed for doing it. And I will recite the poem in a second. The original poem ends with, poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And as a kid, I loved that poem. And so I wrote my satiric version, and instead of the title being Trees.
Because you were playing to the crowd, you know.
I was playing the crowd as I'm doing now, and as I've always loved to do. My poem was entitled Beers, Beers. And it went like this. I think that I shall never hear a poem as lovely as a beer. Its yellow base and snowy cap, I drink directly from the tap. I sit and sip my beer all day, and I remember the gesture until my memory fades away. Poems are made by fools, I fear, but only Bud can make a beer. And of course, it brought the house down.
I'm sure the nuns love that one.
The nuns gave me a couple little frowns, but afterwards, Sister Loretta, who was my sixth grade teacher, I was in eighth grade when I did the poem, took me aside and she said, Daniel, that was really good, and it was the first time I had really done something for an audience that got a reaction like that. And I didn't get serious into writing poetry until I was in high school. I was another one of those students that was just bored to tears. I transferred after ninth grade in St. Joseph's to PHS. And so I went from kindergarten through ninth grade, 10 years of good private education to now the public schools. And I just was so far ahead of everyone that I just kind of lost interest and just kind of flailed my way through. But I did, in my English classes, have a little spark of something ignited when we would get into Shakespeare and poetry. In fact, I started to dabble in writing verse. And for 11th grade, we had an English teacher named Mr. Stevens, and we had to do a book report on a book of poetry. And I did something kind of sneaky. I reviewed a book of my own poetry. And I used a pseudonym. I remember it was J.W. McLennan. And I presented some of the poetry in my report. And I said, McLennan is one of the great and emerging young American poets. And I got a B+ on it.
So you were one of those kids.
I was one of those kids. And education often fails to engage the intellect and the creativity. Something about, think about what happens before a kid gets into school. I'm thinking of public education here mostly, but that kid wants to learn everything. They're curious, they explore, they try things, they fail. They learn through the discipline of nature. You see a kid in his playpen and he's stacking blocks. And if he stacks them the wrong way, they fall. So he learns about gravity and he learns how to do it the right way. And kids are like that with everything they try.
Naturally, they are.
That 100%. And as well, John.
So then the question is, what happens in our schools?
Well, we turn off
and with respect to all my educator friends and loved ones, but there's a system there that doesn't necessarily encourage, and I'm being kind, creativity. And creativity is a process of discovery, of testing, of seeing what works, and being able to fail.
Being able to fail. We don't like failure anymore. It's become one of the cardinal sins in America. There's a Little League out in California that actually was thrown out of Little League because the parents insisted on not keeping score because that would damage the psyches of the children on the losing team. I mean, this is how far it's gone. What happens in education, despite the efforts of many great educators and people? I taught at the college level for 30 years as an adjunct in various colleges. What happens is that the child now sits at a desk like an adult, and there is a plan in place, a regimented educational plan that's thought to be the best for the child, and it has the effect too often of flipping off that switch of creativity. And it's unfortunate when it happens, when you have that particular teacher, though, who finds the switch and turns it on, incredible things happen. There's an essay that I used to teach in my composition class by a writer, Linda Barry. And in this essay, she writes of how at home, she and her siblings were virtually ignored. And she has a great metaphor for how that happens. Her parents would watch the TV with the volume off. And she doesn't come out as a good writer and doesn't hit you over the head with it, but basically she's saying, my parents turned the volume off on our kids and ignored us. She used to sneak out at night. This was in the Seattle area. And in the dark and the pre-dawn darkness, walk her way to school. And she had made friends with a janitor. The janitor would let her in so that she would be there when her teacher, her fourth grade teacher, arrived. And this teacher did something so important to Linda Barry. The teacher saw this kid who just was craving attention and craving to be noticed and craving to be engaged. And she noticed her penchant for doodling and sketching. And she gave the young Linda Barry a set of crayons and pens and paint and pencils and paper, and just said, go ahead. Linda Barry discovered the work her soul had to have. She became an artist and a cartoonist and an illustrator and made a good living at it.
Yeah. And they don't really
in the
teach
essay
that in school.
I'm sorry, John?
And they don't teach that in school.
No.
Se, not in the same, I mean, there's art.
She wonders, without saying it, what would have happened had my teacher not encouraged that? What would have happened to me? So that's the magic that can occur. You know, getting back to poetry, it was when I got into college, particularly at Union College, where I did my undergrad in majoring in English, that I got into the nuts and bolts of language. We took all of the lit courses, American, British, Western civilization lit, poetry, British, the Victorians. I fell in love with Thomas Hardy, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I had all along the way, from grammar school to high school to college to my graduate work, that one or two teachers who saw something in me. Mm. And I had the good experience of finding those mentors. And this happened when I took my first real job, which was in the newsroom at the Syracuse Post-Standard. A couple of editors, particularly George Carr, my city editor, who encouraged my obvious ability to take these 26 characters, A through Z, manipulate them, and come up with something that was communicating, which is the goal, I think, of anything you write, whether it's poetry or prose or a 200,000 word novel or a haiku. You want to communicate something to someone else out there that usually you don't see. You're doing it first for yourself because you have something to say. And I've said this often in talks and in various classrooms where I've had a chance to engage with developing writers. And I would tell them that writing is very much a vocation first. It's something you feel like you have to do. And you've seen this, John, musicians, artists, writers, anyone who has a passion for a certain thing almost has to do it. And we've also seen cases where people have ignored their passion. You know, the ballet dancer who wants to dance and her parents say, you're going to major in business. And
I don't think there's anything more sad, excuse me, in this lifetime when people specifically know what their passion is, because some people may not even get there, but but if you know what your passion is and you do not pursue it, I can't really. We only get one shot at this life.
You only get one shot,
and not to be able to carve something out, even if it's not your full-time job, because we live in this world where we got to pay bills and we have to feed the family, and but not to be able to, in some way, shape, or form, with whatever we have for resources, that you have to do that. That's part of the sole purpose. And if you can feel it, I mean, and I think some people, again, may never get there, but if you get there and you don't follow it, that's a damn shame.
Great point. How do you get there? First of all, you have to realize what that passion is. And that involves a journey inward. It's not going to come from outside. It's going to come from.
And Dan, that's lesson number one.
That is lesson number one.
There's we live in this world where other people's opinions.
Yep.
There's got to be some sort of, other people's opinions, OPP, or OPO.
OPO,
the
OPO, other people's opinions. Yeah, like parents who say, you're going to be a doctor when you grow up and go to school and college. You're going to be a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. My roommate in college, John Rosen, who is now making a great living in technology out in California. His family said he was going to be a doctor, and he was with me at Union College, a pre-med student, turned off by what he had to learn as a pre-med, and was always drifting off and experimenting. He had this little boneyard and was creating these little gadgets and little inventions and stuff. It wasn't for him, the medical. He dropped out, and it could have ended up badly for John. It didn't. He pursued his interest and, ended up making that living. I would tell particularly young people, but because they have time on their side, reach out, try to find out what it is your soul must have.
Yeah.
And then figure out, is there a way I can make a living at this? And try. You've got time on your side. You can fail, and failure is a great teacher, as we all know.
It is. So there's about 3 lessons here. No, the first one is part of finding your purpose is stop listening to other people. And I'm not saying like just stop listening to, don't listen to your parents or to, of course you take, you have to take everything in and you make decisions.
Listen to everybody, but only select what makes sense to you, what works for you. Right. The other stuff, just let go.
Exactly. At some point, you have to stop caring what other people think. I mean, just as at that point, when it comes to what your purpose is. And then, you mentioned the other aspect of finding a career to make that work. That can be a little bit tougher, of course, in our world. But I forgot. I had 3 lessons. And I forgot 2 of them. But anyway,
well, how many?
It starts with listening to yourself,
and I think that's become more difficult with the onslaught of technology. Just look at the pace of life today. It's just, we are on our screens constantly. There are constant interruptions, and technology has become so intrusive that you really have to deliberately and consciously carve out a time and a place and a method where you can retreat from all of that. That's and really do a content analysis of what's going on inside. What do I want? Youth is great for covering up and hiding a lot of things. Remember.
And by the way, that's the other point. You have way more time than you think, because I think a lot of times you're being told, these kids are in college. Oh my God, you got to get out there.
You got to get out there now.
You got to start.
What do you?
And yeah, go make money, but you can also make money bartending at night. So to actually follow your passion, you have more time than you think. Have some patience, and don't think that if it doesn't work in 1 week or 1 month, that's the end game. So patience is another thing.
Well, my favorite question, not that would be put to young people going into college or in colleges. What are you going to major in? You know, asking a 16 and 17-year-old who's not out of high school what their major is preposterous. And it's a question that, and oftentimes from well-meaning parents and guidance counselors and teachers and adult figures will ask this with good intentions, but it can put a lot of pressure on a kid so that he or she thinks, God, I'm a freshman now, I'm in college, I don't know what I'm going to do. You don't need to know what you're going to do. That's what you have to find out, which is the value of a broad, liberal, cross-disciplined education. A little bit of everything. You know, we don't in the lower grades very much teach geography. We don't very much teach home economics. We don't very much get into grammar.
Or how about balancing a budget for the household?
Finances. If I had to make one change in the curriculum for primary education, is that what they call grammar school now?
Yeah.
And it would be, how does money work? What are finances?
Yeah.
How many young people have you seen who whip out a piece of plastic and not realize what they're doing?
And that's not, and honestly, and this is where, you know, I think a lot of us, we look at it as sort of moralistically or whatever. Oh, the kids, they don't know. But the thing is, we're doing this. Now there's a system that's been set up. Why in the world is finances not part of a very basic curriculum? And it makes one think, what are we trying to do here? You know, are we just trying to create more people who are living off a system that
the answer is yes,
that benefits some people but leaves most others in debt or just barely making it?
We want to create consumers.
We don't want
we don't want human beings anymore. We want people who consume. When I was in first grade, one of the things that happened was that, and this was an effort of the school and the parents, we opened up a bank account at what was then the Berkshire County Savings Bank on the corner, the pop corner, now Berkshire Bank. And we had an actual bank book with my name on it. And I remember thinking, wow, I have arrived. And we would have, I think it was $1 a week. And if you didn't have the dollar at the end of the week, it was 50 cents or a quarter. But every week, if you could do it, we were encouraged to make a weekly deposit. And we'd give the bank books to our teacher with the money, a lot of trust. And they obviously had an arrangement with the bank, because I remember our report cards would come in a little envelope that would have the card inside, and it would have a picture of the bank and the name of the bank. So they had an arrangement, and the bank would take care of the deposit, and we'd get the book back, and you'd see, wow, that grew a little bit, you know. And I remember going with my mother to our family's accountant.
That's when you actually used to get some interest from your savings account.
Yeah, and even if it was a couple pennies, I remember asking my mom, where did that come from? And she explained the concept of interest and compounding interest. I was pretty well equipped to understand money. Of course, no one understands money, really. Nobody understands money. Nobody understands economics. It's like quantum physics. If you say you understand it, that's a confession. You don't understand it. But these things are important. Can we get back to language, though?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hey, man, I got all day.
So do I. Be careful. Be very careful.
This is, by the way, I didn't read the
thank you.
entire book, but it's third person singular.
33 into
and
third
this
poems
is-
each.
And this is 3 authors.
Let me
Dan Valenti is the top billing. Tell me about this book.
let's talk about this book. This book is a unique collaboration of 3 poets. You saw their names on the cover. My name, Jerri Chaplin, who is a poet from Charleston, South Carolina. A book that I published, Jerri's first book back in 2011, when there really weren't the platforms for this. And it was a book that she titled Vertically Coastal. And the title comes from the fact that she lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and she and her husband, Peter, great fellow, well met, would come to the Berkshires in the summer and come up the coast and enjoy the arts and everything else you can enjoy about the beautiful Berkshires in the summertime.
And just real quickly, a book of poetry. We're in 2022.
Yeah.
How popular are poetry books now?
Well, if we had written this book back in the 18th and early 19th centuries, for example, George Byron, Lord Byron, was Paul McCartney in his era. He was a rock star. That's how important the arts and poetry were. Now you ask how important it is, and the answer is not very. It's an acquired taste. Not many are acquiring it. But about that first book, Vertically Coastal, we ended up selling. Jerri just sent me an email, Jerri Chaplin, that that book ended up selling 450 copies. Let me say this: if Yale University Press or any of the houses that still publish poetry sell 500 copies of a book of poems, that's considered a bestseller.
Yeah.
We sold 450 copies of that. And third person singular is well on its way. We released it on February the 8th. It's available on Amazon, folks. And if you're an Amazon Prime member, you get free shipping. $15 for the paperback, $9.95 for the ebook. And poetry has what you would call a niche following. And, my philosophy has always been, when you have a niche, you scratch it. So sorry about that.
But,
so
well, I mean, it screams niche, and that is, and the thing is, nowadays, it's the process of publishing isn't necessarily as cumbersome. So
there are the platforms, that word again, John.
Right, at the platforms, and so we were talking about this before, and we'll get back to the book, but like in this universe of a wild west of the internet. Now, the internet was this
unregulated,
completely unregulated.
It was the wild west.
And then over time,
Dodge City without Matt Dillon,
the corporations take over, and they start to clamp down, and even all the platforms within it, the Facebooks and the Instagrams and Twitters, and they start to make things more constrictive, and you have to pay to play and everything like that. So that happens. That's a natural process.
Sure does.
It also has been the case, but in publishing, that it's now way more flexible, and you can sell those books using platforms like Amazon or probably some others, but Amazon is the predominant one. But you can also publish, and that goes without the massive cumbersome process and the overhead that goes with it. So selling 500 books is profitable.
500 books of poetry.
Poetry.
Think about that. What we're doing right now, podcasting, is circumventing what we would have had to have done, and
Right.
which both of us did for years on commercial.
Sure.
We did public radio, but
I did
you
a
would
little
have to go.
commercial, I did a little public, and I did a
Yeah.
little community, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, the
You're a
whole,
radio guy,
but
which
at
is
the end of
why
the
I
day,
love John Kroll, by the way.
yes. And actually, you know, this is more my thing. We did the show on North Street and ran Facebook Live and cut up that content, and it was very big and visual. But this is my thing.
Yep.
And this is more me than anything, you know,
I
this
can,
conversation.
you know what? I'm a good judge of character. I read body language. I can look into someone's eyes when we're doing it in person. And I can just see from, and we've done radio together, John, a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was your gig. You know, I did television for 3 years and along with radio, and it's a whole other thing. You know, there's the saying that TV, why is television a medium? Because it is neither rare nor well done. And that's true, because with TV, you have to have cameras, directors, floor managers, people in the booth, lighting, sound check, everything. And you got to look a certain way. And with radio, you just get the voice. And, you know, when I did my show, the Dan Valenti show on WBRK,
Yeah,
for all those years.
Classic.
And you know this, you take calls and all you have is the voice. And I did something like, I don't know, 4,000 shows. And over all that time, you learn to read a voice almost as well as you could read a book. And that's the fun of radio, you know, the theater of the mind. You're conjuring up words, and people who are listening have images associated with those words. I do want to come back to this book again. Shameless plug, but it is not shameless. I'm full of shame here.
But this, I mean, listen, it is who you are. And, you know, and hearing your story, because I know you're a prolific writer and you've written many books in many different forms, you know, books about the Red Sox, books, you know, about baseball,
travel books. I did a book on medicine, cancer.
I mean, the list of books by Dan Valenti is very long, and I know you're working on an epic book on religion, which I'm looking forward to reading when that's ready to roll.
Thank you.
But here it is. This is where you started. These are really your roots, and I think, you know, we were talking before about poetry and what people learn in school is poetry. Okay, you have the rhyme structure, you have this and that, and many of us have some background in that. You clearly understand that, but there's an old saying that when you know the rules, you know, you can break those rules.
Only when you know the rules.
Only when you know the rules, and you master those rules, it's okay to break it. You know, I think, you know, Picasso used to do that, right? So, and others who are masters. So your form of poetry, what I found, is a little bit more open-ended and structurally more loose but again, from someone who knows the rules, you can break them. So that was my impression on your poetry in this book.
Let me say a little bit about the three writers in here. We talked about Jerri, Chaplin, and of the three authors of third person singular, myself and Paul Kocak, who I'll mention in a moment, Jerri is the most, I would say, emotive, meaning derivative of emotional. She gets to the heart. She goes directly to the heart. And I might read one or two of her works.
Let's do it.
That'll illustrate that.
Yep.
Paul Kocak is a gentleman that I met way back in 1976, the centennial year, the year that America elected Jimmy Carter, or nominated Jimmy Carter, and elected Jimmy Carter to the presidency. I remember the Democratic National Convention in New York City. I was at the Post Standard at the time, and getting a chance to cover that and being exposed to big time politics. Learned a lot that came in handy later.
That's when the convention actually meant something.
It meant something. We weren't sure who was going to emerge with the presidency. Carter, this unknown peanut farmer from Georgia, governor, just came out of nowhere, kind of as a knee-jerk reaction to what had happened during the Nixon years. And Gerald Ford, whose primary talent was bumping his head on helicopter doorways. But back to that, I met Paul Kocak when he joined the paper, the Post Standard, in 76. So we go back a ways, and we've stayed in touch over the years, and glad to say much more in touch since 2012, when he was fooling around with a book that ended up becoming a great baseball title. I think maybe on its way to becoming a classic. It was a memoir that he wrote that centered around the fact that he grew up a New York Giants, San Francisco Giants fan, and his idol was Willie Mays. The book is called Chasing Willie, and it was about his boyhood all the way up through what was current at the time, 2012, 13, and how baseball interspersed with his coming of age. It's a really great book. I highly recommend it. Also available on Amazon.com. Paul is an imagist. Almost, if you're familiar with Japanese poetry and Eastern poetry, they give you the haiku is the perfect example of this.
Yeah.
Just an image. And the image calls to mind a picture, and the picture will trigger certain associations in the reader, we hope. And so his poetry is like that. Mine, let me just read.
Yes.
The format of the book is each of us, the subtitle is 33 and a third poems each. And that's literally what happened. We each composed 33 poems, and we collaborated
on one. I got it.
An experimental work.
And boy, that must have been interesting.
Oh,
because that one poem, you got to put your own flair into it, right? That's really important.
Like if ever a poem was schizophrenic, this poem is. But I wrote the first third of the poem to kind of set us off in a direction, and then Jerri did the second third, and then Paul did the third. And so there is a theme running through it, believe it or not. The amazing thing about this book, and this could not have happened without years of work and the Postal Service doing its job. The three of us have never sat down in the same room together.
Isn't that unbelievable?
The three of us have never been on a conference call together.
Not even Zoom.
Not even Zoom. We have not Zoomed. We have unzoomed. And I was kind of the pivot point here. I just, as a lark, introduced Jerri to Paul via email. I figured, wait, these two writers are doing great work. And I must say, Jerri Chaplin and Paul Kocak are fast becoming known. And I, without hesitation, would call them two of America's finest contemporary poets and writers. I introduced those two by email, and they took up a correspondence independently of me, which delighted me and told me something's up here. They're finding common language.
Yeah.
And so I learned that each was working on a new set of poems. I've been Jerri Chaplin's editor since I first discovered her work in 2011 when we did that book, Vertically Coastal. And she was the first poet in residence at, I forget the name of the famous arts museum in Charlotte, first poet in residence. And she's won many awards and contests and recognition for her work. And I am proud that her work also contains my work because I have been her editor. So I was very familiar with what she was doing. Paulie would send me poems just through email, just stuff he was doing. And I got the idea. We three of us, as I said, never were in the same room together, but over the summer, Paulie would visit the Berkshires and stay with us, us meaning my lovely wife, Lisa, Lisa. And we've got to plug an event that's coming up in Pittsfield on May the 6th.
Lisa.
As far as Lisa is concerned. But so,
man, you are a lucky man.
Oh, I am, Ooh, what a lucky man he was. That's me, except I hope a bullet doesn't find me in the end, like that song. But so Paulie would come up, and then Jerri and her husband Peter, while they were in the Berkshires, came to the house at a later date. And it was then that I got this flash. I said, we're going to do a book together. And as you said, the platforms now make publishing a much a less arduous task than it used to be. The problem in the old days was, you could do a book, but how do you distribute it? How do you get it out there? Well, fortunately, there are places to do that. One is called Book Baby. There are places that you can have that will find these niche markets. But anyways, we got the idea. Let's do a book, John.
I mean, and then there's just also just good old fashioned, knocking doors and getting you into
knocking doors. Each of us had our own small followings, and with email, and you let people know that what we're doing, and we kind of kept it under wraps until it was done. And then when we released it officially on February the 8th, we're doing this in the middle of March, this broadcast, the word gets out there, as you say, in new ways and in old-fashioned ways. So Paul's the imagist, Jerri is the emotive poet, and I'm not sure what I am, because I think the person who is probably the last person you want to ask about their work is the artist.
Sure.
Because the job of an artist, and I would include what you're doing here, John, as art. And my definition of art is a simple one. If the product is purely aesthetic and purely done to feed the imagination, that's art. A chair that we're sitting on, well designed, very attractive, but they first serve a practical purpose. Meant to be someone to sit in them. An architect, you look at the St. Peter's Dome or any beautiful building and you say, wow, that's art. It's artistic, but is it art? I would say no, because its first purpose is to house someone or something. But this broadcast, it doesn't serve a practical purpose in the sense that it's not building a product that is going to serve a physical need. And so that's what art is to me. And when people ask the artist, what does it mean? And it's a great question, and it's a well-meaning question, but my response is, well, I'm much more interested in you telling me what it means to you.
Yeah.
Because everyone's going to read it or see it or look at it differently.
And I would probably, the simpler the explanation, because when you ask the artist, usually there's one thing, right? Like what do you, it doesn't take, you don't have to have 100 reasons to write a book of poetry. You don't need 100 reasons to paint a painting. You just need one reason.
A seed, a germ, a spark
and that's
of
creativity.
An idea. And that's creativity. And from that tiny little spark of imagination and creativity, which we earlier talked about with respect to the classroom, how kids just overflow with that before they get into school. and then something turns that switch off for so many of them. But it's that little seed that it's like the cocoon or pod, to get back to that word, from which the works of art come. So, I could bullshit for, if you ask me, this abstract painting that's behind you, if you put me in front of a room of 1,000 people and I had to riff for 3 hours on that painting, I could do it.
I wonder how many people who come into my podcast studio realize that the painting behind me is actually sideways.
Well, I knew that immediately when I first saw it, John, which was a couple of weeks ago.
If you look here, it's
the like, signature is in the lower left-hand corner, but it fits. It does the purpose.
We popped it in there because that's the best way.
I would start with the frame. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the first thing you see going on here? And at the I would advise my students, would give them works to read, and what's the meaning? What is Shirley Jackson really trying to say in her novel, The Haunting of Hill House? Or what does this? We would sometimes use paintings and images, and I would have them write about what is the meaning of this, and I would advise them always start at the literal level, especially if it's visual. What is it literally doing? Well, literally, we see this painting behind you, John. It has a gold frame, very attractive. It has gold within the painting itself, which picks up on the frame. There are shades of gray and blue, light blue, bluish gray. Something's going on with that. There's a little bit of green. Maybe it symbolizes life at the bottom, coming up, and you play with all of this stuff. And to some extent, that's how you approach a poem. It's not so much what a poem means, it's how a poem reads. Because everything in poetry, if you just take a random page, how it appears on the page is adding information to the meaning of the poem. Wherever a poet, if they know what they're doing, when a poet ends a line ending is a form of punctuation. That's how one of the main ways that poetry is different from prose. Where you break off in a stanza, and there might be a little break, as there is, here, that means something. There is, if you look at some of Walt Whitman's poetry, his poetry will, he'll have a few lines running all the way across. The next line will have one word.
Or if the
it's done for a purpose.
Sort of drips down. Actually, I
actually have a drippy poem.
A drippy poem. That's one of the classic ones.
Can they see that?
Let's see. I'll get a little closer here. I'll zip in here. The one on your left.
This is a poem that begins here and ends on this page. Yeah, you can see it's a graphic. The term for this is concrete poetry, when the physical appearance of the poem on the page is where the meaning lies. And I definitely have some ideas of where this poem came from, but this is a kind of an abstract work, and I would love to hear what people think about something like this. But each of the 3 sections begins with an introduction. So I introduced my 33 poems, then Jerri writes a short introduction to hers, and then Paul does to his. And so we were forced to kind of say something about our work, John. And
as painful as that can be. It's
painful, but it's also fun, because anytime you get a chance to talk about what we're as writers doing, and that's one definition of a writer. To me, a writer is someone who wants their words to be read, to be consumed, because the reader completes the process. You can write a masterpiece and stick it in your desk drawer and it never sees the light of day.
Yeah.
Right. Is it really finished? I don't think so.
That's interesting. That's interesting because maybe are there artists who say, well, I wrote a song and I sang it to the empty air, but it's not empty because there's maybe God's there. I don't know. And then that's it. And I've created. But did anyone listen? If a tree falls,
it does. Yeah. The tree does make a noise. Oh, I think. Of course it does make a noise, which is probably a proof of the existence of God. But that's another topic which we will address on a future show, John. Yeah.
Or today. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. So, like I said, I have no place to go, Dan.
So, yeah, life is tough. I know.
It's kind of snowy out today, you know.
Kind of snowy.
Don't have the kids this weekend.
And, you know, the movie you just starred in, I heard was, didn't do too well at the box office. You may have seen it at the drive-in theater, folks. It's called John Kroll Goes to College with a Werewolf. Some people saw it at the drive-in theater and drove into the screen, but you've bounced back well. We're kind of riffing here, as you see. So here's what I said when we came up with this format. And I said, I want each of us to have a small introduction to what it is we're doing. And I wrote this. I have a confession to make. Having already put together a comprehensive collected works, I had more than 200 poems assembled. When Paul, Jerri, and I developed this idea for a book of the three, I merely took the first 33 poems from the top of the collection. I had maybe, I don't know, 210 poems. I just lopped off the first 33. There, I had my quota. You were expecting some grand strategy behind the selection. That's what poems usually do for reasons related to editorial theme requirements. There's a strategy. We're going to have a book that deals with nature. We're going to have this book deal with animals as our theme. Well, we didn't have a theme. So going back to what I said, well and good, but readers don't need a theme to club them over the head. I gave them way more credit than that. It's poetry, after all, and anyone who reads and appreciates should require nothing more than to be left alone with the words. I find beauty in randomness, as chaos theory shows patterns for which we would never dream to search do lay hidden. Proceeding from that beauty, I discovered patterns in these poems I hadn't noticed before. Look for me and my themes. They're hiding in every line. And that last line kind of sums up how I used poetry from the beginning and probably how I still use it. You know, I make my living with prose, which is pretty much straightforward.
Sure.
Poetry is where I get a chance to disguise and hide some very personal things that otherwise I wouldn't address. And that's how some of my work is. And I think readers come to my work as kind of puzzles and maybe riddles to solve. The clues are all there. Perhaps only I know what they specifically mean, but I think,
at least from your point of view, but once the art is in the ether, then
and that's where it is.
It can have a million other
and the reader
purposes, other themes of anything, you know, and it's all based on the eye of the beholder, right?
Yep. The reader who confronts these 100 poems will bring all of their background, all of their experience, all of their successes, failures, triumphs, tragedies, all of their personal hang-ups, all of their personal togetherness to the work. And they will, from that perspective, infuse the poem with their own prejudices. And I use the word not as a bad word, just their own
point of view,
inclinations.
Sure.
And that's the fascinating thing when these poetry to me is almost like a literary ink blot test.
It is.
And I would see this with my students. We'd give them the poem, uh, William Carlos Williams' famous poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, an imagist poem, if there ever is one. And see if I can remember it. Everything depends upon a shiny red wheelbarrow glistening in the rain next to the white chickens. And the background to that poem was William Carlos Williams was a country doctor, lived in New Jersey. And he had spent the previous 2 nights, this is when doctors made house calls, nursing the sick child of this couple that he had as patients on the verge of death. And through his ministry and who knows what else, the child recovered. And when the ordeal was over, Dr. Williams steps out on the porch, and it had just rained. This is a farmhouse, as you can tell by the poem. And it struck him, having saved this life and seeing the parents just crying with joy. It struck him how important every little moment of life is, which is why he starts out the poem, everything depends upon the red wheelbarrow, the objects glistening in the rain, the white chickens, the ordinary day-to-day things that we pass by. But when you have a brush with death and you come back from it unscathed, you are changed. You are a changed man. Really, any experience, as you and I both well know, John, any experience that knocks you on your ass and just flattens you, and you come back from it, you are a different person. And that's what that poem is. And it's that kind of thing that poets do, they hide in between the lines. At least that's what I do. So
by the way, I love that. And I love the moment, because
the moment, that's all we have.
And that's all there is. That's all there is.
Past is over, future is yet to come, and the moment slips by and we can't grab
That's it. There's nothing else but right here, right now.
How do you stop? How do you grab it? One way to grab it, as artists have been showing us since I guess humans became conscious. You think of the cave paintings, John, done, tens of thousands of years ago. We had to express something about how life is. And I think any product of art, again, something that does not serve a practical purpose first before an aesthetic purpose, is an attempt to capture now, whether it's a painting or whether it's a poem or a piece of sculpture. It's the poet trying to, or the artist or the sculptor trying to stop this elusive nowness that escapes us all. And, the one thing I know that I never wanted to have happen, and it won't happen, is to reach the end. I'm 70 years old, so I'm playing definitely well into the back nine. You don't want to get to that point and just say, I should have. Why didn't I? Why didn't I try? I could have done that. I should have done that. And oftentimes when we try things and we fail, we think that, oh, wow, this is awful. But at the end, you're going to look back on it and say, I gave it a shot. I tried. I did the best I could.
You never want to look back and say, I tried, and I tried, but then if I just tried a little bit more, it was gonna happen.
And you can't avoid that moment, because I think in a moment that is as serious and as sacred as death, there's no more illusion. And you hear about deathbed conversions, and people have a hard time with the concept of their mortality. I think are those who have reached that point, and they have no choice but to confront that question. And I think to some extent all of us will realize, yeah, we failed in some way, but you know what, the overall impression will come through, and it's something you can't fake, and it's something that only you and whatever else awaits us will understand. And it's there. And it's no secret that artists deal with stuff like that.
Yeah, I think
all of the time.
When you find some level of peace,
peace of mind, yeah,
it really you find it, and ultimately, even at that deathbed, now we're getting super existential here. It is like, if there is a purpose, and we're here to learn lessons, and we're here to serve something out, and if our soul's purpose is, if we're able to climb the ladder there and do what we need to do in this lifetime, sometimes that means in our physical world we didn't really do the things that maybe we thought we could or should have, but that doesn't mean on a deeper level you didn't achieve what the soul needs to achieve in this lifetime.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm saying, like, that, and that's where the peace, I think, comes in. And when you talk about people who have, near-death experiences or what have you, I think there's much more solace than there is disappointment. So there you go. Mm-hmm. We've gone there, Dan.
We've gone there. Okay, let's swim back to the surface here, John. And as you well know, I don't mind going there, but maybe in a future broadcast when this
when your book of religion comes out.
It's a book of religion. What does faith mean? What is the difference between faith and belief?
Yeah. And I don't want to say book of religion. I just know that religion is a big
short
part of it.
Yeah. It's really a book of it's a philosophical book where I try to take on the big question: why are we here? Sure. What does it all mean? And I would be the first to say, how the hell do I know? I don't know, but I have thoughts on it. And this book tries to share what those thoughts are as a point of stepping off to a larger discussion, and really points of thought for people who will read this book and think about these questions myself. It's a book that very much deals with issues that were addressed by the great psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung, who did pioneering work in the unconscious and the subconscious.
Speaking, by the way, speaking of majors, that's what I majored in college. It was psychology.
Oh, did you?
So
you are familiar with
back, and yes, I'm very familiar with Jung, and he was my favorite. The
Jungian archetypes. Absolutely. That was pioneering work. Friedrich Nietzsche, who, in my opinion, if you want to understand what's going on today, postmodernism, post World War I, into the chaos that we're seeing today, you need to really understand what Friedrich Nietzsche was about, because he was born probably, I'm going to just make this up, 1845 or so, died in 1900, which is kind of symbolic. And he's the linchpin that links the past, before all of the technological, industrial, military craziness, and the future. And those two particularly play a major role in this book. And it was a book that I first started, believe it or not, in 1990.
Wow.
And I have gone through so many versions of it, and my ideas and notions have changed so much over the years that there's almost a reluctance to finally put down, this is what I declare,
Yeah.
because I'm not meaning to declare anything, but just to, again, share these insights.
It would actually be fascinating to see the draft notes be adjusted over 30 years, because that is, I mean, the literal process.
That's an idea.
No, that is
because I still have that 1990
you just got a free
version.
idea on a podcast. There you go.
I have the 1990 version of the manuscript, which probably came in at about 100,000 words. I sent it off to a publisher. It went to various houses. My agent said it got a good response, but I needed to pare it down into a more digestible format. So I did another version of it, which was maybe about 3/4 of the length. And then I let it be for a while. And when I took it up again, off and on, but when I took it up with seriousness over the first year of the pandemic, I really dove into it, and I came up with a version that was 220,000 words, and I've gotten that down now to about 182,000 words.
Do you ever look back at things you wrote 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and say,
yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure there's some stuff that you said, wow, that's brilliant.
I could have done it better.
I could have done it better. Or even like, gosh, I was really good. Like, because
I've done both.
Yeah, exactly.
But, generally, I don't know about you, John, but I, did all those thousands of radio shows and TV shows and guested on a bunch of them. And I never liked to go back and listen to the show or watch the show. I just didn't like it. It existed in the moment. And for me, if I go back, I say, oh, why did I say that? I could have said that differently. I forgot to bring this up. We all have I think all artists and creators, of which you are one, have the inner critic. And I've found that you don't let the inner critic become a perfectionist, because unless you're Don Larson on October the 8th, 1956.
Did it one time, just one time.
Yep. Game 6 of the 1956 World Series. And Don Larson threw a perfect game. Only one in series history. Unless you're Don Larson on that day in Yankee Stadium, you're not going to throw a perfect game. And so I tend to
even if we have the same metaphorical perfect game, it doesn't come around that often.
Oh,
it only
no.
you know what I'm saying?
About as frequently as it did for Don Larson, who the irony was for the rest of his career a mediocre pitcher. There's a funny story about that game. He was not supposed to pitch that day. I forget, it was maybe Allie Reynolds or somebody else. And that somebody else couldn't take their turn. Larson was a known partier. He would life of the party, hard drinker. And the night before, knowing he was not going to pitch, went out and got plastered. This is New York City. There's a bit of a nightlife in New York City, John. I don't know if you realize that.
I have heard that.
Larson went out and got hammered, and he comes in the next day hungover, thinking he's not going to pitch. And he goes to his locker room and he sees the ball, what Casey Stengel, the manager, would do if you were pitching that day. And it's not like today in baseball where they have starting rotations like science,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't necessarily know. This is the 6th game of the World Series. The Yankees are down 3-2. If they lose, they go home. Larson goes to his locker room and sees the ball at the top shelf of the locker. And he realized, I'm pitching today. God. And he goes out and throws a perfect game.
Yeah. Yep.
So if I may, can I read a poem
yes,
or two?
And just a real quick thing on that.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you are not feeling well and you know you're not just 100%, sometimes the focus that you have is greater. And I go back to that time that Michael Jordan, he had the flu or something. I don't know what it was, but he was clearly sick. And it was against the Utah Jazz, I think it was. And he was unconscious. I mean, he was unstoppable. They couldn't guard him. He hit everything. Of course, Michael Jordan is Michael Jordan, but that game in particular, and he was sick. And I think there's a mental level that you have to get to overcome it. And sometimes you outperform what your normal performance would be. So anyway,
I think that's true. You look, Mickey Mantle is famous for that. Mantle, Whitey Ford, and Billy Martin, big partiers. Mantle would often come later on when he tried to get sober too late in his life. Really a sad story.
Yeah, it is.
The Mick would often show up hungover and go out and have his best days. I think there's a lot to what you say. I think of the great, in my opinion, Bill Russell, the great center for the Boston Celtics, the greatest player in basketball history, only because of the way he changed the game. Before every game.
Still one of the most underrated basketball players in the history of the game to this day.
Yeah, well,
even back then he was overshadowed by Wilt Chamberlain.
But he had Wilt's lunch.
He did it, you know.
He had Wilt for lunch. The only player who knew how to get into Wilt's head. Before every game, literally, Russell would get so nervous and so keyed up that he'd throw up. And on the days where he was under the weather, maybe he had a cold or something, he would have to deal with that and throw up. And he even mentions this, came across this in an interview, that just what you said, John, your point, that when he was not at his best, he played at his best because he had to dig in and get more. You know,
it's interesting. All right. So
let me read
poetry.
All right.
Do this now.
we'll do a couple here.
By the way, Dan Valenti's feeling fine. You know, he's not under the weather, you know, but
no,
he's still going to perform at a high level.
Thank you.
On this reading.
And knock on
it's wood.
Knock on wood.
It's wood-ish.
I'm feeling great. And it's my smoothie every morning. That's part of it. And my daily.
Oh, do you drink smoothies?
Oh, I am a smoothie man.
Do you make it or does
I make it?
At least okay.
In my Vitamix. Do not miss a morning and try not to miss a day of a 4-mile walk.
Nice.
Which is, again, what we talked about earlier, you know, just stepping away and kind of, I do a lot of that when I walk. Just.
And I assume when the winter is, well, maybe even during the winter, but when the winter subsides, more time in the brook, the river.
Mm-hmm.
There's a river that runs through nearby your house
on our property. Yeah, on our property, we have this great river, and as a matter of fact, during the cold spell, it froze over, and Lisa and I got the shovel out, cleared the snow, and actually had a chance to play Hans Brinker and put on my skates.
Nice.
Skate on the river, where I tend to live in the summer, by the way. Nice to have that in the backyard.
That is awesome. What a cool feature.
Anyway, so, you know, they just, and I do not want to get into baseball, as you said. I did a lot of baseball books back in the 80s and 90s. And as Chico Escuela used to say on Saturday Night Live, played by Garrett Morris, baseball had been very, very good to me. I wrote the baseball books just at the right time. And you know, it's funny because when you're with, this is back in the day, publishing was a totally different industry than it is today. But I did most of my books with Viking Penguin, which is one of the big New York houses. And when you have a hit, which we had with the first book I did for them, The Impossible Dream Remembered, they want you to do the same thing. And so we did a series of baseball books, and I grew up a baseball fan, loved doing it, got to hang out with a lot of baseball teams back in the 80s, including the Red Sox. And so it was fun doing it. The game has now changed tremendously. They just settled a long lockout because the owners and the Major League Players Association could not agree on how to divvy up billions of dollars.
Yeah. Yep.
Billions of dollars. Okay. We're talking at a time now where Mary Jane and Joe Kapansky are going to the gasoline station and filling up their gas tanks and paying, $4.34 a gallon. That's probably going to go up because of what's happening in Ukraine. It's really lost all connection with what even back in your day, John.
Sure.
The ordinary fan who could walk up to, I remember walking up to the box office at Fenway Park in the 70s, and they say, the ticket office, can I help you? Yeah, I'd like 4 boxy tickets for me and my buddies. Where would you like to sit? And we'd name our seat. Now, what's it taking a family of 4? If you took your family to the ball game at Yankee Stadium or Fenway, John, you're set back what, $400 or $500?
Yeah. That may be low estimate.
It's probably
at this
low.
point. Yeah. And so totally inaccessible to the average Joe, as it were.
So they've lost me now, but I do still enjoy the game. The game we used to play growing up, lived at Deming Park, played in countless sandlot games, play organized ball in Little League and Babe Ruth. And
happily, we can still go to Wacona Park and see a good ball game.
Yeah.
And
minor league ball and collegiate ball is relatively immune from that type of inaccessibility and just greed that powers the major league version of the game. So baseball, just in the abstract and purely as a game, is still something that I love and have fond memories. Here is a poem, if you want to follow along on page 8.
Yes.
Here, that was written for this book. And it was before the lockout, but I knew it was coming. And this is a poem called Fair or Foul. And in this poem, I use baseball as a metaphor for life, which is one of the why there's so much great baseball literature, because it's pastoral. You go home. The idea is to go home. And here is the poem, Fair or Foul. The fragrant grass, even topped from the mower's blade, wears a lime coat of home whites and road gray shade. Whitewashed lines determine fair or foul. The ball has no motive. It will land as hit, an indifferent reaction to the swing of a bat and Willie losing his hat. But the batter, what deceptions lie under that human's practiced swing? It plays out when the ball is tossed and the play's the thing. We are star-crossed, and the game, it is won or lost.
There it is.
Fun to compose something like that. I'll read one more here. This was a poem that I wrote the day after John Lennon was assassinated.
You wrote it all the way back then.
That was December the 8th, feast of the Immaculate Conception for the Catholics.
Now, what page is this, by the way?
Yeah, this is page 21.
Okay.
It was December the 8th. I was house sitting for a friend, and it was a below zero night. I remember how cold it was. And it was Monday night. We were watching Monday Night Football. The New England Patriots, John Smith, their field goal kicker, is about to kick the tying field goal, sending the game into overtime. Howard Cosell breaks into the broadcast with the sad news that John Lennon was assassinated, killed, gunned down in New York City. It was a shock.
That is huge. I mean, to this day.
Why would anyone want to kill someone like John Lennon?
Yeah.
And I wrote this poem the day after and worked on it ever since, and finally got it to a version that I did for this book. It had not been published before. And the title is The Man Who Got Out of His Car. And if those of you who don't know, John Lennon had just come back from mixing what was his final album, Double Fantasy, with his wife Yoko Ono. And they had just come back from the studio that night on December the 8th, doing one of the final mixes. And John was in a great mood that day. He was excited about bringing music back into his life. He had had a 5-year hiatus after he left the Beatles in his early solo career, and then took 5 years off. And this is his comeback album. Couldn't have been a happier guy. Finally, troubled man all of his life, lost his mother in a car accident early, and he was that classic angry young man. And it finally seemed that he was getting it together. He steps out of his car and is gunned down by this overweight young man who has in his hands and was seen reading earlier before Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And Lennon gets out of the car. Mark Chaplin, the killer, steps up to him and just unloads the gun into John's chest. Sits down calmly at the curbside and waits to be arrested. Who knows why? Wanted to be famous for killing a beetle? Come on. So let me read this. The Man Who Got Out of His Car. Immaculate Conception. Again, that's the reference to the day, December the 8th, 1980. Immaculate Conception, night sky feeder. The man gets out of his car. Get your pipe in. Check that. Get your pipe and put that in, paperback reader. That's a play on the Beatles song, Paperback Writer, and an allusion to the fact that Chapman was reading the novel. Get your pipe and put that in, paperback reader. I'm telling Chapman where to stick it. Catcher in the Rye, my ass. Your finger on the trigger. Nobody can do you no harm because happiness is a warm, coward gunslinger. Making a play on some of John's lyrics. Steps out unarmed except for his wit. Grabs his stomach and screams, Ringo! Not ready for the hit. Witness, relatives, meaning Yoko, who's by his side when this occurs. Falling trees, slumps on the Dakota steps, misunderstanding all he sees. All of what he says is meaningful. That's the end of that poem. And the end of the poem is a play on his song that has the lyrics, half of what I say is meaningless. All of what he says is meaningful. Poetry gives us a chance to address, and certainly, as John Donne, the poet, said, every man's death diminishes me. Seek not for whom the bell tolls, the funeral bell. It tolls for thee. And every death does diminish us, John. And whether it's John Lennon or the people who are these innocent people who are caught up in what's going on in the Ukraine, it's a tragedy. Shouldn't happen. And poetry is a way a compact way and just one page to make a statement about it, as I tried to do with that. And to me, it's therapeutic before anything else. It allows you to get on paper. It's one of the classic remedies of therapy. In your psychology major, you have patients or people who are in mental distress keep journals, try to write it out, right? You know about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, it's part of the, actually, it's interesting. I was thinking how John Lennon said half of what I write is meaningless.
Half
And,
of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia. That was a song he wrote for his mother. And it's on the White Album. And he wrote it. He never got over the death of his mom. It happened when he was a lad, like 11 years old. And she had just got through visiting her sister, John's aunt, Mimi, who raised John. Julia, his mother, was this free spirit, loved to play music, just full of laughs, didn't take being a mom seriously, although she was a mom, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And she had just left from visiting her son, John, and her sister, Aunt Mimi. And she was walking back to her flat nearby and got run over by a bus. And John Lennon never got over that. If you want to have an experience, folks, keep that in mind and put a set of headphones on and listen to his song, Julia, the lamentation for his mother. This is a boy crying out for his mother. And you listen to that and you tell me that the Beatles and John Lennon in this case were not artists, were not poets. It's just quite a moving thing. And that's what the arts should do. I get this question: what practical purpose is the art, or are the arts?
Yeah.
And I laugh at that and I say, well, what practical purpose is mathematics?
Right. Or what practical purpose is, owning real estate? What practical purpose is anything?
Is anything
based only upon the constructs that we have in this world of what is quote unquote important and what is not. If there's an emotion, if there's a feeling, if there's some intellectual fulfillment, but not even that. You don't need to justify something, because I think we need to really start to rethink the human experience.
Oh, you are on to something so good here. It's almost like if it's art, we have to come up with an apology for it. It's not this thing we consume. It doesn't buy into the whole greed thing, unless you're, and I'm not putting down authors like Stephen King or Danielle Steele or the ones who, no matter what they write, will have J.K. Rowling, with the Harry Potter series. More power to them. Their names on the cover are, this big, and the titles are that big. They're publishing because of what they've published. And as a matter of fact, the way the publishing industry today, mainstream publishing, houses such as Bantam and Viking and the biggies, which are owned by conglomerates, run by lawyers and bean counters. Every time Stephen King does a book, those publishers lose money because they have to spend so much for the rights to the book that they will never make it up. The ones who pay are the small-time writers that you will never hear about, which is now a reason to avoid mainstream publishing. These are my views, and go indie. Back in the day when I was writing and selling my books, couldn't write them fast enough. I had an agent out of Boston, Thomas Hart, Literary Enterprises, and he was that rare agent that actually stayed in touch with his clients and tried to, I won't say he was not a lawyer by training. He was an accountant, but he knew how to file his teeth down into sharp points when dealing with the with the lawyers for the publishing houses. Now, this is back in the 80s. And I remember the contract that Viking sent us for The Impossible Dream Remembered. And it was this long document with, 50 clauses in it and all the whereas and wherefores and all the legalistic language. And he told me something I never forgot. He said, this is the contract they want. They would love you if you sign this. And he says, we're not going to sign this because we got to tell them what we want. And so we struck out the clauses we didn't want. He formulated the language to incorporate what we wanted, and we struck a deal. Today, if you're someone who is not a Stephen King or a J.K. Rowling, and you sign with a major publisher, they're basically going to do what I, as a publisher of this book through Planet Media Books, and there's our logo right there, a large publisher will do exactly what I'm doing and not much more. Today, if you're not a big time author, you're required to do practically all of the marketing, practically all of the selling of the book. They want to take cost out. They'll throw the money at the big guys, and they will not give you the money if you're the small guy. It used to be back in the day, I wasn't known then, and I got pretty decent advances.
Sure.
Now they act as if you're doing them a favor if you publish this book, and you try to get in advance, and it's like you're asking them to, break the law or something. And it goes to our point that somehow artists are just pushed aside. They're these people that just dabble in these wacky ideas, and they don't really relate to us here. We're making our money, and we're signing the contracts, and we're doing all these important things, and we're at the press conference, and we're starting wars, and but we'll let these little poets and artists do their things, and we'll have an event or two, so we can show we love the arts. And these indie platforms, such as we're doing in the podcast, or now that we're doing with publishing, indie is the way to go with music. Indie is the way to go with making. You want to make a movie? Don't go to Paramount. Don't go to Universal. Make your own film and find a distributor. I had a fling in Hollywood back in the 80s. I got involved. It's a long story, which I won't tell, with the star of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who played the drill instructor, Sergeant Hartman. I don't know if you've seen the film, Full Metal Jacket. Yeah. I am Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, your senior drill instructor. And from now on, the first and last words out of your filthy sores will be, sir, do you maggots understand? Under my training, I will make you ministers of war praying for death. But until that time, you are nothing but pukes. You are maggots. You are the lowest form of grabastic shit on the face of the earth. And it is my job to weed out all the non-hackers that do not pack the gear to serve in my beloved corps. That guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I ended up in
Got it down. Got it down. Nicely done.
Thank you. Thank you. I ended up doing a book with that guy, a book and a screenplay. Mm-hmm. By that, you do a book, film with Stanley Kubrick, you are on the map. And long story on how I hooked up with him, but I did for about 3 years. And we developed a novel and a screenplay. I had to go out to Hollywood. And it's a place where, let me put it this way, one producer actually had a pair of Dayglow shorts on that said domination. And he had a holster on his desk with squirt guns. That's Hollywood. strange place even back then. This was before it too was taken over by the conglomerates. Sold a couple of not even screenplays, treatments. A treatment is something you do before a screenplay. One was the idea I had for a comedy. Another one was an idea I had for a serious film based on the cheerful topic of suicide. And what I found out later, there's a great line in a film with John Turturro and the film is called Barton Fink. Fink is a New York playwright, goes out to Hollywood. He's asked to write the script for a Wallace Beery wrestling picture. Not great art. He experiences writer's block. And anyways, he ends up totally disillusioned with Hollywood, as I was. And on his way out, they were kicking him out of the studio, and the big shot studio owner says, Fink, you're not a writer, you're a write-off. And I realized later that they bought my two projects as a tax write-off. My agent told me this. They had no intention of producing anything. I think Paramount was owned by Gulf and Western at that point. Paramount was one of the studios. And Gulf and Western wanted their Paramount, their movie division, to have tax law write-offs for tax purposes, which they then transferred to another part of Gulf and Western. And I realized, yeah, I made some money, but I was a tax write-off. And to this day, Hollywood devalues writers dime a dozen. And I would never go out there again or get involved with the movies. A script, anyways, is a blueprint. If a movie gets to the screen, now you got the producer and director just totally doing what they want with it. So it's not really a work in and of itself. But that was my experience. So, and publishing is like that too now. The mainstream huge publishing companies are really owned by these larger corporations, and they're just merely divisions, and oftentimes will lose money deliberately on a Stephen King, on a J.K. Rowling, on a Danielle Steele, so they can write off the money somewhere else in the company.
Yeah.
It's a shell game and a money making scheme for them.
Yeah. And now you're seeing, a lot of the creativity is being pumped out in other places. So, you see a lot of creators on social media, on YouTube, TikTok now is big. And even today, even though those are more freewheeling, you're still, seeing pushback from individuals and creators saying, wait a minute, TikTok, you're using my creativity to promote your app and to get more followers on your app. So there's always control. There's always control of the medium. In other words, whether it's Hollywood that does the production and the distribution, whether it's TikTok, the app, or YouTube, the app, so unless you create your own platform. And so, but I think, this is happening so rapidly all the time that there's always going to be the new thing and the new thing and the new thing, because, Facebook is kind of like 2008, and now it's more TikTok where you see creators and that sort of thing. But I guess that's part of the evolution as to when we said at the beginning, well, the internet was the Wild West. Now it has consolidated and
much more regulated
and all that.
As soon as you start attracting numbers, you'll find the people with the money, the venture capitalists and
vultures.
The people who have the money will come in, and if you have the numbers, they sense a way to make money. We were talking about this in your kitchen, John, before we went on not on the air here, before we went on the photons and are doing this, but how if there's a way where they can make a buck off you, they will. I'll give you an example. I hope many of our listeners and our viewers are familiar with my blog, Planet Valenti. We're now, it's 11 years old. We've done about 2,400 columns. We publish 3 times a week. And it started out just as a pure writing exercise to write for this thing called the internet. And to this day have not done any advertising of the site other than word of mouth. And sure enough, over the years, it's slowly built up. 1 tells 2, 2 tells 4, 4 tells 8, and so on. And it got to the point now where we had sufficient numbers where an IT guy that I met in Syracuse, New York said, you got enough traffic here where we can commercialize the site. And I'm thinking, well, why not? I made a rule I would not accept any local ads, because I know how in commercial publishing, whether it was with newspapers or film writing or books, anywhere else, if it's commercial, there's a price to pay. And I didn't want to have any local advertisers.
For as much as they say that they use the term now, firewall. Oh, there's a firewall between the editorial and the advertising. Well, that's until an advertiser, a big one, calls up and says, I don't like what you're doing.
We've both been on the end of that, John.
Yeah. Or if you have the publisher and the editors basically saying, hey, ease up. They're one of our big advertisers. Why don't you kind of shift it? So again, firewall until you see reality. And
I saw this happen.
We've all gotten every media outlet I've worked for back when I was a journalist got one of those calls.
There was some of that. Yeah. And,
for sure.
It was like when I was in newspapers, the firewall was supposed to be between the editorial room and the business side. And it was a daily war. And if you had strong editors, they would stick up for their crew and stick up for their reporters and their editors and say, no, we're going to run this story. I've seen that happen. And I've seen where the editorial side caves in, spikes the story because it's going to piss off this important publisher, whether it was a car dealer or a bank or whatever it was. These independent forums, such as what we're doing now and what we did with third person singular, our book, allow us to circumvent that. But I was getting back to my blog, planetvalenti.com. Check it out if you haven't. I think you'll have some thought-provoking fun there. We do 3 columns a week. It got to the point where we were getting the numbers where our IT guy said, we can get ads. How do you do that? Well, he knew how to do it, the mechanism for it, the technology for doing it. Ended up with Google basically becoming an ad agency for Planet Valenti.
Mm-hmm.
It works like this. I agree, signed a deal with Google that we would make space available to Google to run ads from companies that Google got.
Right.
So I would host the ads, Google would get them, and we would publish them. And the deal was Google would get some of the money and I would get some.
And what Google does in its algorithm says, okay, here's the content in the blog.
Yep.
Our algorithm, they don't sit there and read the blog and say, oh,
nope.
Well, we think this would be a good space for
a
Joe Biden ad or something like that. What they do is, it's an algorithm, and then all of a sudden something that is advertising through Google then pops up, and that's the ad that shows up on the blog.
Exactly. Well, Google doesn't read the columns, but the algorithms read. And every so often I would get a message from Google that the ads for this particular column were taken down because the content they found was objectionable. And I remember through my IT guy trying to get them to define what was objectionable, and they would not do it. They would just say,
of course not.
No ads until you address the problems in the column. We did this a number of times, and finally I told my guy, Jim, my IT guy, I said, nope, I want to do this. They are doing what I hoped to avoid. They are censoring what I want to say. He said, no problem. and he gave me a list of other companies that would do the same thing. And I went with the one that everybody knows. I went with Amazon. And so Amazon took the place of Google on planetvalenti.com. And I now provide space. Amazon fills them with their ads. And Amazon has not said a word about anything I have written, not one word. We've been with Amazon now for maybe a year and a half. And if they stay out of it, I'm happy, they're happy. And it's just part of what you have to do, John, to make a living today. There's some part that you have to concede. And I've really never got the artist, the artist who says, I will not compromise a bit. And that's not how it works. From day one, when I decided I wanted to make my living juggling these 26 characters of the alphabet, I wanted to make money for that. I wanted to get money from whomever wanted to pay me for writing words and speaking words. And I said, I don't want to end up as the tortured artist who's just writing all this great stuff and sticking it in the drawer.
Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting paradox.
I don't want to be the starving artist.
As we're talking about the corporatization of things, there are these pockets of democratization that allow you to be unimpeded with free speech, with saying what you would like to say as an artist or anyone, and having this sort of tool that would reward and does reward if you have the volume of listeners, of viewers, of readers, whatever it may be. There is that mechanism, and that's the same thing in audio or video. If you have the numbers on YouTube, you'll be able to reap the rewards of advertisements that are basically pumped in by the algorithm, not chosen necessarily by you, and that's kind of understood. The consumer understands that as well.
Great point
at this point.
And I would go back and say, okay, on my blog on planetvalenti.com, notice how I keep saying that.
I know.
But on the blog, the question is, how did you get the number? They didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of here, just like you do. I live the life of the mind. That's my product. My wits created the blog, and the wits of these three writers in our latest book produced this book. But I got the numbers on my blog because I wrote content that people wanted to read. Maybe they wanted to read it just so they could say, what a son of a bitch that Valenti is, and that's fine. But we got the numbers. Mm-hmm. Now you get the numbers, and now you get, as you it's a great word before, the vultures. They come sniffing around.
Right. But interestingly, in this way, you're backing into it, as opposed to front loading it and convincing a publisher or convincing an editor that your content is worthy. Mm-hmm. Well, democracy has done its job, or the democratization of the internet has done its job. It already says you're worthy because you're getting the number of readers.
That backloading in and of itself is not a criterion for determining quality. TikTok is a great example.
Good example. Yeah, of course.
And that's the problem with the democratization of media.
Oh, yeah.
It allows everybody. Yeah. It allows the junk and the chaff, as well as the kernels of wheat and the gems.
And make no mistake,
there's far more junk than there are gems.
And trust me, to get a million or 2 million viewers on TikTok, there are some easy ways for some people to do that. Yeah. That it doesn't necessarily include intellectual strength. You know what I'm saying?
Or
So
artistic
or
strength.
artistic strength, or whatever, however you want to describe it. Let's put
Yeah.
it this way. You know, there's a lot of things that sell.
I'll give you
Yeah.
another example of front ending or front loading a book project. During the pandemic, I was pretty productive. I wrote a book that I've been wanting to write for 30 years. It was a book that sums up everything I've learned about writing. And a lot of it came from having to teach composition to college students. I taught Comp 1, Comp 2, expository writing, news writing, courses in media, a course in communication, the communication process. What is that all about? And I've been wanting to, in teaching courses, you would adopt handbooks and books like On Writing Well by John Zinser or Elements of Style by Strunk and White. And I said, it'll be neat. I've got something to say. I want to write a book where other instructors and other writers would want to have by their side as kind of like a how to and what I've learned about writing over the years. I wrote such a book, and I approached one of the top academic publishers in the world. Look them up, Peter Lang Publishing. They have offices in Berlin, Germany, Oxford, England, New York City, LA. And I said, I'm going to try them. Sure enough, no agent. I don't have an agent at this point. I made the proposal, met a wonderful editor, Danny, D-A-N-I, Green, and she encouraged me to develop a proposal. We did, ended up with a contract to write the book, which I did. And then it goes through, they well vet these things. So in other words, I had to provide a book that they considered worthy enough that we had to front load. So now I'm dealing with a traditional commercial publisher, but one that's not owned by a conglomerate. That's the difference. And they took the manuscript, and first it had to pass the editorial review in-house. It did. They then passed that to 4, what do they call that when people in the profession read the manuscript? Peer review. 4 unknown to me, they don't tell you who it is, but peer reviewers read this book and basically would get back to the publisher with a report that, yeah, this book is good enough, publish as is. This book is good, but it needs these changes. No, do not publish this book. We got the 4 back. All of them, 1 had published as is, and 3 had published with these changes. And I have to say, they were, for the most part, really good changes. I steered the manuscript away from being a college handbook to a book that would reach a wider audience, which is the academic world, but also writers in general. And the book is called Write It Real, R-E-A-L. It's a book on how to write prose. And I revised the manuscript based on those recommendations. Then it went through 2 final reviews. Again, 2 different peer reviewers now. So this is 6 in total, had to go through it. And they came back with recommendations. Yeah, this is a go. I figured, great, now it's done. Then I get word from Danny Green, my marvelous editor. Thank you, Danny, if you ever see this, that it has to go through a pre-production review at Peter Lang Publishing. And we wait for that. Danny Green's assistant, young man by the name of Joshua, gets back to me with 2 minor changes. We do that. Finally, it's ready to go. And I'm pleased to say we hope that book will be out in June of this year, 2022. And so that's a case where I had to deal with a traditional publisher, but again, not one of the New York biggies, because you're not dealing with that publishing house. You're dealing with their owner. You're dealing with their bean counters who want to just make money however they can, and their lawyers who are afraid of everything. And there you go. Many ways to do this, John.
And there you go. So we should probably wrap this up.
Can I just plug in
I want you to plug the event, just because I'm just worried I can't, I don't have enough space on my computer.
We filled up the memory.
I'd be really, I'd be really pissed if this didn't capture everything. But
okay. Quick plug.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the first Fridays are back.
First Fridays are back.
That's awesome.
Well, actually, this is the first Friday arts walk in Pittsfield. It's going to be on May the 6th at the Universal Unitarian Church, 175 Wendell Avenue, a beautiful brick mansion that was owned by the owners of England Brothers Department Store. For those of you who go back a little bit to Pittsfield, the event is titled Valenti and Valenti, an evening of art and poetry, and it features my lovely wife Lisa Valenti, who is an artist. She makes her living that way. And that evening on May the 6th from 5 to 8, at that venue, 175 Wendell Avenue, they're going to exhibit a large room of Lisa's work that will be on show and on sale. Across the room on the same floor from 6 to 7 p.m., the three authors of this book are going to be reading from this book.
So you're going to meet them for the first time?
What? I've met both of them.
Oh, you've met them.
The three of Jerri and Paul have not met in person.
Okay.
Only through email.
Okay.
That's it, John.
That's unbelievable. That's a wrap.
Salute.
I mean, we could probably continue the conversation after this. I just want to make sure this damn thing captures everything, because we have about 2 hours under our belt here. So
okay.
Dan Valenti, man, we're gonna have to do and we'll real quickly, we're probably gonna have to do a double date on this podcast at some point.
Have me as a regular, John.
Have you as a regular. Bring Lisa in.
I would love
Cara,
to do that.
And we'll just. I just got to get a couple more cameras in here and a couple more mics, and we'll be all set. But maybe a table.
I know a venture capitalist called Dan Valenti who will help you invest in a project if you wish.
Love it. All right, my man.
Okay.
Peace
Good
out,
to see
everybody.
You, man.
Yeah.